So good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending. I'm sure you're drawn in, as I was, by this very enticing title, Conclusions versus Decisions in Quantitative Research. Dr. Catalin Tufanaru is going to talk to us today. He's based at the Joanna Briggs Institute here in Adelaide. And you can get, they're one of the association sponsors, and you can see all the things that the JBI get up to through our website or through their website. It's got a range of activities, Catalan, but the few that I picked out are that he's involved in the NHMRC Centre for Research Excellence in Aboriginal Chronic Disease Knowledge Translation and Exchange. He's authored 5 books, and the other thing I found was interesting was his involvement in the Restoring Invisible and Abandoned Trials project, which I must admit I wasn't aware of, but it sounds like a very valuable enterprise. I forgot to mention the conference. So before I interrupt that introduction, I'll just remind you of the HSR conference in November. The call for abstracts closed on Friday, so we're busy reviewing those abstracts and get back to submitters as soon as possible. But just to note that the early bird registration ends at the end of September, so you've still got some time, but obviously if you're planning on coming, it'd be good to get in before the early bird deadline. So after that brief interlude, back to Catalan. So I'll hand over to you, Catalan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you for this great opportunity. I am happy to present this webinar. This is a very interesting topic for me. I would like to thank also Associate Professor Zach Mann from JBI, who introduced me to the association and who gave me this opportunity to present this webinar today. So I'm Catalin Tufanaru. I'm a research fellow at the Joanna Briggs Institute at the University of Adelaide. We are part of the School of Public Health. We are part of the Faculty of Health Sciences and Health and Medical Sciences. So the topic of my presentation today is Conclusions versus Decisions in Quantitative Research. I will present for probably 40 minutes, and then we'll have 20 minutes for discussions. And I hope we have some discussions, questions and discussions. I really like this topic, and the purpose of my presentation today is to share with you my thoughts about this, and I would like to challenge you, and I would like to hear your thoughts, and I will present my position with regard to this topic, and I would like to learn your thoughts, your ideas about this important topic.
Catalin, sorry, it's just Sarah. Just let delegates know that they can ask questions. There's a Q&A button if they use their mouse and go to the bottom of the screen. There's a Q&A button, and you can type your questions in there while Catalin's presenting, and then John and I will relay them to Catalin at the end and share your comments, and he can answer any questions you have, just in case people weren't aware.
Please ask as many questions you want using the radio button and the facility of the software, and then we'll discuss the questions at the end. Okay, so the overview of my presentation today, I will start with an introduction. Why this topic? Why it's important? Why I consider that is important? And I will ask you some questions in this introduction section, and I will provide my answers at the end, but I would like to hear your answers and your commentaries with regard to these questions. So I will define conclusions, I will define decisions, I will compare and contrast conclusions versus decisions, and I will discuss about 3 important procedures that are used in frequently statistics in quantitative research: significant testing and their p-values introduced by Fisher, hypothesis testing and and the errors and the approach that was introduced by Neyman Pearson. I will discuss also confidence intervals introduced by Neyman, and I will provide at the end some recommendations based on my understanding of the field, and I would like to ask you to challenge these recommendations or to discuss these recommendations, and let's have a discussion. And I would like to see what do you think about my proposals, my recommendations. So at the end we'll have this session to discuss the webinar and to allow you to ask questions and to provide your commentaries. And I decided to focus on these three approaches: significant testing, hypothesis testing, and confidence intervals, because these are very common. These are procedures that are used in frequentist statistics in quantitative research. Okay. So I'll start with some questions, and I will give you my answers at the end of the webinar. But I would like you to think about these questions and think about your position and your thoughts about these questions. So what do you think is the duty of quantitative researchers? So what is the duty of quantitative researchers? Is to provide evidence with regards interventions or with regards programs or policies, to provide conclusions or to draw conclusions based on the results of the research, or to decide. So there are three aspects: summarizing the evidence, drawing conclusions, or decision making. Think about these three aspects. So what do you think? What do you feel? What is your position about these three aspects? Is the main focus of quantitative research for us as quantitative researchers to provide evidence or to draw conclusions and to provide these conclusions in reports, or to decide? Okay, now, the other set of questions for you is this one. I told you that p-values, so significant testing, p-values, hypothesis testing, and confidence intervals are very popular tools, common statistical tools that are used in quantitative research. So I ask you, are p-values providing evidence about interventions? Or are these p-values decision tools? Are hypothesis testing providing are hypothesis testing procedures providing evidence for or against different interventions or policies? Or are hypothesis testing decision tools? And the same question for confidence intervals. These are very, very popular tools, and these tools, confidence intervals, are advocated as replacements for p-values, are recommended as very useful tools to replace p-values. Now, my question is, are confidence intervals providing evidence, or are confidence intervals decision tools? Now, let's start with conclusions. So we all have some thoughts or some intuitions what conclusions are in general. So when we say we concluded this or the conclusion is this, we have some understanding what the conclusion is. In this webinar, I will provide this with this explanation for a conclusion. And this explanation was provided by a British mathematician, statistician, Wood, who worked for many years in America. And he said that the conclusion is usually the acceptance for the time being of a hypothesis. So we accept something for now, we accept a conclusion that it is what is stated in that proposition or in that hypothesis. So this is the explanation that I give you for a conclusion. the acceptance for now of a proposition or a hypothesis. Okay. So what is a conclusion? I consider also that this is a very, very important explanation, and this was provided by a famous American statistician. So a conclusion is a statement. So this is very, very important for our discussion today. It is a statement, and this statement is accepted as applicable to the experiment or the observational study that was conducted. And this is accepted until we observe evidence on the with regards to contrary to until we observe evidence that will refute or will contradict this initial statement. Now, I think it's important to read carefully this explanation provided and definition provided by Tukey, because this is very important. So he said that a conclusion is a statement which is to be accepted as applicable to the condition of an experiment or observation unless and until unusually strong evidence to the contrary arises. So there are very important aspects in this explanation and definition. So it is a statement that is accepted, but however, this applies only to the condition of a specific experiment or observation. And this is accepted unless and until we have different evidence, but not any type of evidence unusually strong. And he emphasized this in the article. So we need unusually strong evidence. So this is an interesting explanation and definition. Okay. So with regards to decisions, he said that when we discuss about decisions, we have to think about a set of different aspects. So we discussed that conclusions refers to statements. Now, decisions refers to sets of possible actions, consequences, and evidence about these consequences. So decisions are about actions, decisions are about acts, decisions are about possible actions and their consequences, and also about the evidence about these possible consequences. Okay, so I think we have a nice contrast between conclusions as statements about hypotheses or about facts or about observations or experiments, and decisions that are viewed as possible actions with their consequences and the evidence about these consequences. When consequences are examined, the evidence is about these consequences, not about the actions. Okay. So when we talk about decisions, it is about the evidence about the possible consequences for different actions, for these consequences of different actions. So we decide, when we say that we discuss about decisions, we discuss about specific circumstances, specific alternatives or actions with their possible consequences. And with regards to decisions, we talk about the decision to act in a specific way. So you can see that there is a very important distinction between conclusions and decisions. With conclusions, we have statements and we accept these statements. With decisions, we act in a specific way and we act in specific ways because we assessed the possible consequences and we assessed the evidence for specific consequences, or possible consequences. Now, it is important to emphasize that when we make decisions and when we say that we decided and the decision is this or that, there is no judgment about the truth or the reality of the statement. With conclusions, we have the truth of a conclusion. We have the reality of a conclusion. With decisions, there is no judgment about the truth or the reality of the conclusion. We just assess the evidence regarding the consequences of different actions, and we decided to act in a specific way. So a decision is not a judgment about the validity or the truth or certainty of a specific statement. Now, with regards conclusions, it was noted that this should be reached cautiously, firmly, not too soon and not too late. Think about these recommendations and think about what you see in the published quantitative literature. Are these conclusions that are published in the scientific literature reached cautiously, firmly, not too soon and not too late? From my point of view, I think that so many times we see statements that are called conclusions that I think that were reached not cautiously, too late, and sometimes too soon. Now, conclusions should be judged by their effects, long-run effects, by their truth, not by the specific consequences of specific actions. Now, why are conclusions important? I consider that conclusions are very important because when we reach conclusions as defined in the way that I told you, I think these conclusions will build a body of knowledge. So these conclusions will enrich the body of knowledge. These conclusions will help us to understand better the problems and the solutions that are explored in quantitative research. And I think this is something that we have to think about. Conclusions are real conclusions when they have lasting value. And conclusions are lasting values extracted from the data. I think this is a very, very nice definition of conclusions. Lasting value extracted from the data. And this is contrasted with decisions. With decisions, we don't have value extracted from the data. We have actions that were actions with their consequences and evidence for consequences. With conclusions, we are in the field of the value extracted from the data. So I think this is very important, and I think that and to give you an answer to the questions that I have at the beginning, I think that in quantitative research, the role of the quantitative researcher is to extract value, to extract the information, to extract knowledge from the data, not to decide actions based on their possible consequences, but to extract knowledge from the data. With regards conclusions, these real conclusions are considered accepted until unusually strong evidence to the contrary arises. Now, if you think about this, that conclusions remain accepted until unusually strong evidence to the contrary arises, think about what you see in quantitative research, what you see labeled as conclusions. Do you think that most of what you see in quantitative research, in published quantitative, are conclusions or something different? Another important idea is that conclusions are always accepted with condition. And the condition is that conclusions are accepted subject to future rejection, if new evidence is available. So conclusions are of lasting value, but not necessarily of everlasting value, because it is possible that conclusions are rejected in future based on evidence. So I told you that we have to think about the existing published literature and to think about if we have real conclusions or not, or what we see in the quantitative research, in the published quantitative research, we have to judge if these are real conclusions or not. Now, I think it's important to make the distinction between the use of conclusions and decisions with regard to statistical procedures and research process and research results. When we say that we make decisions with regard to statistical procedures, this means that we decide to use specific statistical procedures based on our understanding of their performances, optimality, and so on. When we reach conclusions about statistical procedures, this is something different. We have statements about the properties of statistical procedures. So this is one use of these terms and concepts, conclusions and decisions, with regard to statistical procedures. Now, there is another use of these concepts, conclusions and decisions, with regard to the research process and research results. We decide to use specific samples, to conduct research in a specific way, and we decide to do this based on our understanding of the research process and the research problems. But we have also conclusions. It is possible to draw also conclusions about the research process and research results. So it is important to make the distinction between these two applications of the concepts, conclusions and decisions, with regard to statistical procedures and the research process and research results. And it is important to highlight that when we reach conclusions, when we reach statistical conclusions, it is considered by methodologists and statisticians that always statistical conclusions are weaker than statistical conclusions are weaker than experimental conclusions are weaker than statistical conclusions. So statistical conclusions are based on the use of statistics in quantitative research. However, experimental conclusions are about the conclusions about the results of the quantitative research. And because there are many possible systematic errors at different stages of the research, always experiment conclusions or research conclusions are weaker than the statistical conclusions. Now, I said that I want to discuss about three approaches that are common in quantitative research. One is the significant testing approach called the Fisherian approach. This approach was introduced by Ronald Fisher in the 1920s. So one null hypothesis is proposed, a test of significance is used, a test statistic is computed, a p-value is computed based on the test statistic, and the null hypothesis is rejected if the p-value is small. Now, my question is this approach providing evidence about an intervention or a policy, or is this a decision procedure, or is what kind of conclusion is possible based on using this approach? I would like to share with you this important information that Ronald Fisher, the father of modern statistics, he spent his last years of life in Adelaide, and when he died, his family donated all the documents and all the manuscripts and everything to the University of Adelaide, and we are lucky to have this unique collection, Fisher collection, at the University of Adelaide, at Bath Miss Library. So Ronald Fisher is considered the father of modern statistics, and he invented the p-value, the significant testing. Okay, so why it's important to discuss these procedures? Because I think it is our duty to clarify the principles of scientific inference, and I think it's our responsibility to understand the processes we apply or we recommend. Now, I think that it's important to share with you this idea that Fisher proposed, that the purpose of quantitative research, and I really believe this, the purpose of quantitative research is to generate knowledge and to share this knowledge in such a way that will be useful for all other freely reasoning minds. So, what is our duty? So I answer the question that I presented at the beginning. I think that our duty, and I use this idea from Ronald Fisher, I think our duty is to formulate and to summarize and to communicate our conclusions in intelligible form. And I think it's important to recognize the right of others to utilize this information, these conclusions, in making their own decisions. So by saying this, I would like to emphasize that I believe that our duty is to present the evidence, and to present the conclusions based on that evidence in such a way, in intelligible form, that will allow others to make their own decisions. I consider that it's not our role to make decisions. Now, with regards the distinction between conclusions and decisions, Fisher emphasized that in his view, the role of the quantitative researchers, the role was to generate knowledge, and this without any cost or without considering the consequences of actions. So this is why he said that no cost function for faulty decisions should be included in the process. Our role in quantitative research is to generate knowledge and to communicate the knowledge for the enlightenment of other free minds. I think this is very beautiful. This is very nice. I really like this, and this is what I believe, that our role, our duty is to communicate scientific findings for the enlightenment of other free minds. And this is without any consideration of the costs or costs of wrong decisions or possible actions and their consequences. So this knowledge should be shared regardless of any future potential uses. Fisher emphasized that the role of significant testing was to generate conclusions, to generate evidence about different hypotheses. So he presented his approach as an approach for conclusions based on evidence. And he insisted that these conclusions were not irreversible decisions, but conclusions that are possibly revised. And I think this is very important to emphasize, that Fisher insisted that his approach was one one approach providing evidence for the disbelief in a hypothesis. So his approach was not an approach of making decisions to reject a hypothesis or not, but it was an approach of providing evidence with regards to hypothesis. Okay. Now, I think I will. With this, I think I will close this section on hypothesis testing, significant testing. So the essence of Fisherian significant testing is to provide evidence against the null hypothesis, and this evidence is formulated as a conclusion. Is possibly formulated as a conclusion. However, this is not a decision process. Okay. Okay. Now, with regard to this approach, some statisticians argue that in reality, the p-value is not providing evidence against the hypothesis, and I think it's important to share with you this view that some statisticians consider that p-value is not providing evidence against the hypothesis. So in this way, it's not possible to provide conclusions with regards to hypothesis. So some will argue that this is not a conclusions type of approach. And one statistician from America, he was very strong in his thoughts that and his views that the significant test failed to quantify the strength of statistical evidence. However, I think that significant tests are providing a quantification of the strength of statistical evidence against statistical hypothesis. What is interesting is to share with you Fisher's thoughts about likelihood. And he was convinced that the best way to summarize the evidence in the data was to use likelihood of all possible values for the parameter based on the observations available. And he specifically stated that for the communication of the evidence provided by a body of data, the best way is to use mathematical likelihood. And he insisted that the likelihood ratio function is the best way to summarize the evidence in a body of data. Okay. I will discuss now about confidence intervals. Confidence intervals are very, very popular, are recommended, are advocated in quantitative research as a wonderful solution for summarizing the data, for providing a summary of the evidence. And I consider that this is a misinterpretation, and I will share with you my thoughts why this is a misinterpretation to use confidence intervals as tools for summarizing the evidence or tools for providing conclusions. A confidence interval is just an interval estimate that is computed using a procedure that has a 95% rate of success in the long run. However, a confidence interval is not providing the information about the possible values for the parameter or the likely values for the parameter. We don't know if the true values of the parameter are inside the confidence interval or not. So the confidence intervals are not tools for summarizing the data, are not providing conclusions about the data. And it's interesting that Neyman, the inventor, Jerzy Neyman invented this in 1930s, and he specifically said in an article that we cannot conclude or believe that the true value of the unknown parameter is in the computed confidence interval. So you see, he rejected this idea that confidence intervals are conclusion procedures. No, these are not conclusion procedures. He said that confidence intervals are decision procedures. So when we compute the confidence interval, knowing that the confidence interval was generated by a procedure that has a specified known probability of success in the long run, we may decide to behave if we knew that the true value was inside the confidence interval. So he insisted that confidence intervals are decision procedures, not conclusion procedures. Okay. I will finish with Neyman-Pearson approach, the hypothesis approach. This approach was introduced by Neyman and Pearson. This is the known approach with two hypotheses, not just the null, but also the alternative. And in this approach, types of errors are introduced, and power is computed before the research is conducted, and no p-value is involved. Now, with regard to this, I would like to share with you this important idea that Neyman introduced this approach with Pearson, and he clarified the meaning of this approach, and he said that this is about actions, and this is about the consequences of actions, and this is about decisions. So Neyman insisted from the beginning that his approach was the approach of decision making, not an approach to summarize the evidence in the data. So he specifically stated that hypothesis testing are used when we have to make decisions between different causes of actions with different consequences. And he specifically explained that hypothesis testing are tools or procedures for choosing actions. And he insisted that to accept a hypothesis and to reject another one is to take an action, and this was a decision procedure. This was not an assessment of the true value of a hypothesis. This was not about summarizing the evidence from the data. Okay, so I think I have to skip this. I have always too many slides. Now, I will finish with these sorts very important ideas that were provided by the father of modern epidemiology, Olli Miettinen. He said that it is very important to understand that the most important task of a quantitative researcher is to summarize the evidence in the data. And he said that we have to make the distinction between summarizing the evidence and reaching conclusions, and of course, making decisions. So he said that the most important thing is to summarize the data, and interestingly, he shared the same thought, the same ideas with Ronald Fisher, and he said that the best way to summarize the evidence in the data is to use the likelihood ratio function. Now, I will finish now by summarizing my position. I think that we as quantitative researcher, so what is our role and what is my position? I think that it's not our role to decide about different actions. I think it's not our main task to conclude. It's fine to conclude, but it's not our main task. I think that our main duty is to present the evidence or to summarize the evidence. In other words, our main duty is to present what the data say. And I believe that the best way to do this is to use the likelihood ratio function as suggested by Fisher and Miettinen. So our duty is to facilitate the interpretation of verifiable observations. So our main task is improvement of knowledge. So to provide answers to the questions that I presented at the beginning, I considered, regardless of the criticism by many statisticians, including Richard Royal, I consider the p-values provide evidence. I consider that hypothesis testing are decision procedures, they are not summarized in the evidence in the data. And I consider that confidence intervals are decision procedures, not tools to summarize the evidence in the data. And finally, I think that the information in the data is summarized in the likelihood ratio function. So these are my recommendations. I think that we have to present the evidence. We have to present the evidence first. Present what the data say. Second, it's fine to provide our conclusions, but the first duty is to present the evidence that will be used by others to reach their own conclusions. Third, I think it's important to clarify to all users of reports that the evidence is not conclusion and that conclusion is not decision. I think that the most important thing is to clarify the weight of the evidence that is actually supplied by the observations. And I think our duty is to provide measures of the rational grounds for the disbelief, as Fisher said. I believe that the essence of the quantitative research is that the quantitative research is a process of learning by observation and experience. And I think that we have to share and to communicate the findings in such a way to allow the enlightenment of other free minds. And we have to think about that our findings, our scientific findings, will be put sooner or later to different purposes. And maybe we don't know now these purposes. So final conclusion is that we have to formulate and communicate the evidence and our conclusions in intelligible forms, in recognition of the rights of other free minds to utilize them in making their own decisions. I think this is a very nice, very nice recommendation by Fisher, to recognize the rights of other free minds to utilize the conclusions, the evidence in making their own decisions. Okay, so I finished my presentation, and now I'm happy to answer the questions or to hear commentaries. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Caroline. That was got through a lot of very interesting issues and proposals. Thanks for that. We've got one comment from David Birnbaum. She says we've got three, but one. So I'll read it out in full. It's a nice response. So definitely an interesting and important topic. Being the editor of a journal that focuses on policy and governance, I'd agree that researchers have a duty to provide evidence and discuss conclusions, along with limits to interpretation, consistent with their research findings and those findings relative to other published studies. However, in terms of decisions, I agree with Justin Parkhurst's preference for evidence-informed policy rather than evidence-based policy. And his book's discussion of the natural tensions between political debate as well as pertinent evidence that should inform the decision after governance priorities define the policy questions that need research-informed answers. As such, point estimates and confidence intervals constitute evidence, p-values do not, and decisions are not inherently solely a statistical exercise. Thus, we seem substantially in agreement.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I think it was clear from my presentation that statistics is not enough. And I think it was clear from my presentation that different statistical approaches in reality are considered tools for providing summary of evidence or not, depending on views of different statisticians. So I think this is something interesting that I would like to know if viewers or participants agree with me that in a way p-values provide evidence, but confidence intervals and hypothesis testing are not providing evidence, are decision procedures. I think this is a very important point in my presentation, and I think this is an important point for discussion.
Yeah, so David's come back, he's saying, yes, most decision makers are uncomfortable with likelihood ratios, unfamiliar with Bayesian methods, but most comfortable with confidence intervals. And the fact that narrow intervals suggest higher precision, so greater safety in rendering a decision. And Christian Wiley has asked, do you see the scope to draw conclusions and to make decisions differ if the study is a meta-analysis or a literature review?
Well, as I said in the final part, I think the most important thing is to present in a meaningful way, in an explicit and scientifically correct way, the evidence. Based on this evidence, then we are able to draw our own conclusions. However, I think it's important to provide this opportunity to readers and users to draw their own conclusions based on the evidence from the research. Then, if they want to make decisions based on these conclusions, this is something different. And I agree that in a meta-analysis, when we have many studies, it is possible to draw stronger conclusions compared to individual studies. And Fisher insisted on this idea of replicability. And this is why I think it's important to discuss the distinction between evidence, conclusions, and decisions. When there is only one study or a limited number of studies, I don't think that we are in the position to draw strong conclusions as defined in my presentation. I don't think we are in the position to draw strong conclusions. It is fine to present the evidence from these studies, but I don't think we are in the position to draw strong conclusions. And if we are not in the position to draw strong conclusions, then decision makers should be aware of this weakness of the evidence. However, if in meta-analysis we have enough robust replications or evidence from studies, then we are in a position to draw stronger conclusions and to inform the decision-making process. But of course, the statistical conclusions or the conclusions based on the quantitative research are only a part of the process, and other considerations, political considerations and so on, are part of the process.
Sure. I must be one thing that picked my ears was the reference to the cost function for faulty decisions. I think that was Fisher, wasn't it, who talked about
yes, Fisher rejected the approach proposed by Neyman and Pearson. And he said that in quantitative research, we don't have, he said that in quantitative research, the essence is generation of knowledge, and therefore it is impossible to think about the costs of wrong decisions. He said that the idea that significance testing or quantitative research using significant testing is a decision process, he said this is completely wrong. He was against these ideas, and this is why he rejected the cost functions and the costs of wrong decisions. Yeah.
I suppose just to play devil's advocate, if we think about different types of decisions, so decisions maybe where the costs of faulty decisions are negligible, you know, so the researcher is in a position to, I mean, the researcher is never in a position to actually make, well, they can make decisions, but they can't act on the decision. But you know, if based on the decision or a decision that the researcher is trying to inform, the researcher can judge that the costs of making a faulty decision are negligible, or where the costs of reversing a faulty decision are negligible. Are those two possible areas in which the researcher could propose a decision?
Well, I think researchers should be involved in decisions, and I think that the reference to Fisher and my discussion of Fisher was only with regards to the evidence that is provided by a study. But if we are discussing about decision in healthcare policy and healthcare, then I think that it is important to use this larger view that in reality the decision-making process is the right approach, and we always have to take in consideration the costs of wrong decisions. So I want to clarify this. When I said what Fisher said, this was only with regards to the generation of knowledge, for example, evidence about effectiveness or harms of interventions. So this was about improved knowledge. However, I think that always we are in a decision context, and always there are costs of wrong decisions, and we always should be part of this process, and we should view this evidence of effectiveness or harms in this context, larger context of consequences and cost of wrong decisions.
Yeah. I mean,
so I'm not saying that a significant testing approach is the way we should do it. No, I said only that we have to be aware that the tools that we are using, for example, confidence interval, significant testing, they were designed by their creators or inventors for specific purposes, and not necessarily for accumulating evidence or for summarizing evidence. And I agree with you that we should always understand that the big picture is a decision-making picture. The costs always are of wrong decisions are always important.
The other phrase that I made a note of was right at the start, where you were talking about, conclusions represent the evidence at the current point in time.
Yeah.
Until and unless the unusually strong evidence to the contrary occurs. So is it the researcher's responsibility or role to define when that unusually strong evidence comes into being, or is that a decision-making role?
I think all should be involved, because we as researchers, we have the duty to summarize the evidence. Now, if there is new evidence that is strong new evidence, on the contrary, we should be involved in this and defining what is strong evidence. However, if decision makers are using the conclusions based on the evidence, I think they should decide also, they should have this freedom to decide what is strong evidence contrary to the existing old evidence that will inform their decisions. So I think that this is why I think it's very important to make this distinction between evidence, conclusions, and decisions. So it is the role of quantitative researchers to provide the evidence, and if we want to define what is strong evidence against previous evidence, it's fine. However, I think that because conclusions are used to inform decisions, those framing or drawing conclusions and making decisions should be also involved in defining what is strong evidence of the contrary.
Agreed.
Yeah, but I think, you see, I think that the essence of my presentation is that it is important to make this distinction. There should be a clear-cut distinction always in research, quantitative research, because between the evidence that is provided by the data, the conclusions that are drawn based on the data, and researchers may or may not draw conclusions based on their data, and the decisions that may be informed by the conclusions.
Okay. I've just got one last question from anonymous attendee. If the conditions under which samples were drawn and evidence is mentioned in terms of these conditions, we can say we provided evidence, not aimed to state, we can say we provided evidence, not aimed to state the evidence as decision aid. Shall I say that again? If the conditions under which samples were drawn and evidence is mentioned in terms of those conditions, we can say we provided evidence, not aimed to state the evidence is a decision aid or as a decision aid.
So if we know the sampling procedures and the sampling procedures were used in a correct way, my understanding is that we are able to provide evidence. Well, if we use statistical procedures that were designed to provide evidence, yes, I agree. So it's not, but in the same time, because we provide evidence, this evidence may or may not be used for conclusions or for decisions. So this is why. So what we see, what we provide as a summary based on the sample data is a summary of the data, but this may be used as a decision aid, yes, but it's not necessary a decision aid. Maybe we stop there, we provide the evidence, and others will use that evidence to draw conclusions and further to make decisions.
Yeah, and following on from that, David's Birnbaum again is saying, quantitative evidence certainly provides an important type of information about what is or is not working, but doesn't reveal context. And so he's asking what your view is of the relationship between quantitative and qualitative research to inform policy.
Yes, first of all, I think quantitative research is providing a very limited type of evidence about what is working or the effectiveness and harms of specific interventions in specific trials or institutions and so on. So this is first the discussion about the results that were observed in a specific context, and the problem is the generalizability or external validity of the studies. This is a huge problem. Now, with regards qualitative research, I agree that qualitative research is very important because qualitative research will capture other aspects that are not examined in quantitative research. For example, the meaningfulness, the experiences, the feelings of participants and their views and their opinions and their, so I think that in healthcare and in policy making, we need both quantitative and qualitative research.
Great. Now we've got another good question, which I think is a good one to finish on, maybe. So researchers may not make conclusions, but their analyses, p-values, will inevitably be used to determine action or decisions based on statistical significance. How do we start to make the change?
Okay, now I think a very, very important issue is to provide interpretations. So I said that our role is to summarize the data, but we have to summarize the data in such a way to avoid misinterpretations. So for example, if we provide the exact p-value, we have to provide a narrative description of our, or we have to provide an interpretation that will guide the readers. So even if we don't have a conclusion, even if it's not a decision, it is only a summary of the data, and we use a p-value or a confidence interval or the results of our hypothesis test, we have to phrase our statement in such a way that to avoid misinterpretations and to guide the readers and users in understanding what we are saying. I think this is the challenge, to provide our statements in a meaningful way that will not distort and will not distort the evidence that is provided by data, and will help the readers and users to understand what it is about. And I'll give you an example, and with this I finish. Let's not say results are statistically significant or not, or the hypothesis was rejected or not. Let's phrase it in terms of how strong is the belief or disbelief in the hypothesis, or how strong is the evidence about a possible value for the unknown parameter in the population.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Catalin, this is the kind of thing that you're teaching through the JBI, is it?
Yes. So I'm teaching statistics for evidence-based healthcare. So I'm teaching we have this module, Statistics for Evidence-Based Healthcare, and I'm teaching this to our master students enrolled in the JBI program, Master of Clinical Science in Evidence-Based Healthcare. And this is what I tried in the last years, to make this transition from a mechanical view of statistics to a more informed, and I tried to explain to our students why we use statistics and what were the intentions of creators of statistics. For example, I tried to explain our students why Fisher created p-value, why Jerzy Neyman created confidence intervals, because I think understanding is important. So what I said today, is in the same line of thoughts that I use when I present to our students.
That's great. What I'm taking away from this is the need to help in terms of interpretation. So that's the key in terms of our role as researchers, is to really make the interpretation as clear as possible.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's it's bang on 12 o'clock, so that's good timing. And as I said at the start, unfortunately, we haven't the function for applause, but all I can do is thank you on behalf of all the attendees. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you. Thank you.